Hi, I'm Sarah from The Upcoming. Such a pleasure to be able
Hi,
to speak
Sarah.
today. Maybe you could just kick off with a brief introduction to this documentary, Hijacked. For people who don't know anything about it, what can they expect?
So it's a film about the hijacking of a Pan Am 747, Flight 73, on the 5th of September 1986, with hundreds of people on board. It was hijacked by four terrorists, and it's the story of what happened once they'd come on board and how the hijacking played out. And it's set in the context of the politics of the period, the sort of geopolitics of the period. And the idea is to sort of contrast the visceral experience of those who were on board that day with what was happening in the political picture, broader political picture, to try and understand the context in which the events unfolded.
And what was the starting point for you? And why did now seem like the right moment to make a film about this topic?
Well, starting point for me, I mean, I was approached to make the film, so it wasn't an idea that I had generated. I think it's the reason to make the film was that it's a fascinating story full of drama that had never really been told properly. There had been a Bollywood movie about one of the flight attendants, the narrative of which is much disputed by people who are present that day, but that's another story. So there was a sort of sense that a documentary had never really done it justice as a story and never really set it in the right political context. That it was sort of presented as a thriller rather than understanding that there was more to it than simply the events that happened on the day. You had to understand the context, the backstory, and so on. And also, we wanted to meet the contributors in the present tense as well and feel like we got a sense of what the legacy of the experience had been for them.
And so, I mean, how familiar, if it was something that, they came to you with the idea, how familiar were you already with the events, and where did you have to begin kind of with your research and, collating all of that and thinking about what kind of form it was going to take?
So I was familiar with some of the detail without actually knowing the name of the flight and the actual place it had happened and so on. There's one or two details, and without giving stuff away, that are quite singular about this hijacking, and those things I remember them from my youth, hearing about them. I didn't know a lot of the information. There are a few books been written by survivors from the hijacking. So there was plenty of source material to get into. There were also lots of documents to read. There were court hearings and so on, and we could read transcripts from those. So there was a large amount of background research to do. And then we set about what we always do, which is exploring the possibility of people contributing towards the film. And that takes the utmost sensitivity about approaching people and asking them if they might be prepared to take part in the project. You have initial conversations with them, which are essentially to aid with the research, and they're not obliged in any way to take part in the project. And normally what happens in that situation is that the actual act of talking about events starts to open up the idea to them of perhaps taking part. We never try to persuade people to take part, because that ultimately never works. And a lot of the contributors saw the value in going back over a pretty horrific experience for many of them, because they felt that understanding the context of it and understanding what the legacy had been and so on might actually be of value to people, and the insight that could be got from the story might in some way help other people in the future. So we set about doing lots of pre-interviews with lots of passengers. Not everybody we interviewed wanted to take part in the project, but were happy to help us with research and so on. Most of the people that took part in the film had, to some extent, spoken about it before, if not in court hearings. In the case of Mike Thexton, the British passenger, he had helped train police hostage negotiators and used his experiences to be able to use his experience for some positive good. So I think that it was it was quite a long process in getting quite some of the people on board. They needed plenty of time to think about whether they wanted to revisit the events of that day, and the memories that they have of it and so on. So yeah, it's quite a drawn out pre-production process before we started any filming.
Mm. And yeah, how long was, to give us a bit of a flavor, how long was that process, you know, from beginning the research to having the final product? And what might have been some of, you know, the really challenging moments along the way, but also on the other side of that, some of the highlights for you?
Well, I'll start with the highlights. The highlights was meeting the people involved, who are all incredibly inspirational, and you know, considering what they witnessed and what they went through, I thought were just so inspiring. Their bravery was really remarkable, and it's a real privilege. One of the great privileges of making documentaries is you do get to meet people who are simply extraordinary, and you know. At a certain level, you get to know people during the process, and that's always a real pleasure too. That you have these introductions to people who live all over the world, and you would never have met any other way. The challenges were, there were a few challenges, a fair few challenges. One bit, because it was a 747 airliner, a lot of the contributors, people that took part in the film, were based all over the world. So we travelled from San Francisco to Karachi to Dubai to, you know, all over the place, basically, filming our interviews, which was challenging with COVID restrictions and so on. One interview was done remotely. The interview with Safri and his uncle was done. He was in Jordan and I was in London, but that was done remotely. But also a story that's 35 years old. It's very important for us to make sure that people's accounts tally with each other. And if they didn't, we didn't include them, because people understandably have different, I mean, even if it had happened 5 years ago, people still wouldn't be necessarily fall into line on some of the details. So one of the challenges was streamlining all the stories so that they felt like they fell in the right places, which is difficult because everyone has a slightly different memory, and people lost track of time and so on. They were all on that plane for such a long period of time, but they couldn't swear to the time that things happened. So we had to try and build our timeline based on lots of different accounts. The other challenge was that there wasn't really any news archive, obviously being a hostage situation. There wasn't any footage of that. And there was also very little news coverage at the time. There were various news anchors doing their best to update the news and bring you the latest information. But in terms of footage, there wasn't really any footage of it. There was a couple of exterior shots of the airplane, but the Pakistani army shut the airport down very soon after the plane was taken over. And so that meant representation of events had to be done with reconstruction, which was one of the enjoyable parts of the process, was trying to work out how we could reconstruct something which on a big scale. This is a 747 with, you know, 300 people on board, but trying to be able to render that in a way that felt satisfying. But yeah, so there were a lot of challenges. But the biggest privilege and pleasure of all was meeting the contributors. That question.
And I'm almost out of time, but you know, just very quickly, what do you hope people will take away from watching it and revisiting something that, of course, you know, a traumatic event, but like you say, the inspirational people, you know, that you can also reflect on. And if you could say a few words also about how this fits in with, you know, some of the other documentaries you've worked on, and what you might be working on next.
Well, I'm always really drawn to stories that pit ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, where they discover qualities that they perhaps didn't know they had. I find I'm quite often asked why I make documentaries about traumatic experiences or harrowing experiences, and actually the reason is quite a simple one, is that partly it's great to be able to give people a platform to share that experience, because quite often that process can be helpful for them. It can also just increase insight and knowledge and understanding of those situations, which could be helpful for others in the future. But also I find those stories, those people are inspirational, because they remind you that in extremis, you too might find qualities that perhaps you don't think you've got. But the most important thing for me was to show in this film that the people that were affected by this event, ordinary people for the most part, were basically caught up in the geopolitics of the time, and there was all this high-level game playing going on, and diplomacy and cynicism to an extent played out among these global leaders, and these poor people were basically just caught in the kind of the collateral damage. They were caught in the crosshairs. And I think that's a subject that I'm always drawn to in other films that I've made, is that how ordinary people on the ground are left to pick up the pieces from the high-level game playing that goes on. As far as what I'm doing now, I'm making a film about the miners' strike of 1984-85, where those themes are also present. There's lots of high-level game playing going on, and meanwhile, people on the ground are just trying to do the best thing they can by their families and eke out a living and all the rest of it. So that's what's coming up.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for sharing all that with me. And yeah, can't wait till everyone has the opportunity to watch the documentary on Sky. Thanks so much.
All right, thanks a lot. Cheers.
Thanks, Lily.